Welcome back to Hardware Unboxed. Now, recently I put together a 41 game benchmark comparing the GeForce RTX 4060 and Radeon RX 7600, and I found that on average the Radeon GPU was 7% slower at 1080p, and although it did cost 10% less, I ended up handing the GeForce GPU the win for its superior feature set. Though I did fully acknowledge that neither GPU was particularly impressive, and in the current market probably should be avoided, and instead I pointed gamers towards previous generation products such as the 6700 XT, which for roughly the same money does offer more performance and more VRAM. But there is also cheaper options, and today we're going to look at one of them. But before we do, today's sponsor spot is brought to you by us, Hardware Unboxed store, so hardwareunboxed.com. If you go there, you can check out our merch. Only available to US-based viewers at this point in time, so apologies to everyone else, but we are working on making it a bit more global. Anyway, we have it depends. If you guys have watched the Q&As, you'll know that most of our answers start with it depends, and it became a bit of a joke, a bit of a meme for the Q&A series. So we've got a Tim and Steve 8-bit it depends hoodie available in a few different colors and of course sizes and stuff. So if you're interested in that, check it out, and there will be more cool, funny meme merch to come. But anyway, that's it. Get back to the video. Okay, so it's been a long time coming, and while not entirely my fault, the updated Intel Arc benchmarks, they are well overdue. Now, previously I had planned to include the Arc A750 and A770 in our RTX 4060 and RX 7600 day one reviews, but due to compatibility issues with some of the games that I was testing with, they were dropped from the results due to a lack of time to solve those problems if they were solvable with the current driver. And since then, Intel has released a number of key driver updates that do solve those issues while also improving performance in a few other games. So I thought it was about time that I tried a 40+ game benchmark with an Arc GPU, and it wasn't all that smooth sailing, I have to say, but we were able to get there in the end, and I'll talk a bit about that towards the end of the video. For now, let's touch on a few pricing discrepancies. I am well aware that the RTX 4060 and RX 7600 currently cost significantly more than the A750, with the Radeon GPU at $270 and the GeForce GPU at $300, while the A750, that can be had for as little as $200 US, though it is more commonly found up around $220 US. Still, it is much cheaper even at that price, as that's a 27% discount when compared to the RTX 4060. So in terms of specifications, the A750 features the same 8GB of GDDR6 memory as you'll find on the RX 7600 and RTX 4060, but it uses a much wider 256-bit memory bus, allowing for a bandwidth of 512GB per second, and that's a massive 88% increase over the much more expensive RTX 4060. The A750 also uses the full PCIe 4.0x16 interface, whereas both the AMD and NVIDIA GPUs are limited to half of the PCIe bandwidth. On paper, the A750, it does look pretty good, especially for $220 US, though of course, in the past we have found that it is only able to roughly match parts like the RX 6600 and RTX 3060, so how will it stack up against this newer generation of AMD and NVIDIA GPUs? Well, let's go find out. For testing, we're using our Ryzen 7 7800X 3D test system with 32GB of DDR5 6000CL30 memory, using the latest display drivers. In total, I've tested 41 games with 54 different configurations, but we're only going to look at the individual results for a dozen of them before checking out the big breakdown graphs. But please note, all graphs will be made available to Floatplane and Patreon members. Okay, let's go take a look at what we've got. First up, we have Fortnite, and here we're using the DirectX 11 mode, so no fancy ray tracing or anything like that is enabled, and the A750 does really well here, edging out the RX 7600 to come in 17% slower than the RTX 4060 at 1080p, and just 7% slower at 1440p, where the additional memory bandwidth is really coming in handy. Now, enabling ray tracing with the highest quality preset results in pretty poor performance overall, but here the A750 is now not that much faster than the 7600, and is able to roughly match the 4060 at 1440p. Moving on to Star Wars Jedi Survivor, the A750 was good for 60 FPS at 1080p using the Epic Quality preset, making it 15% slower than the RTX 4060, which is impressive given it is up to 33% cheaper. Then at 1440p, the margin is heavily reduced to just 9%, and again, we see that the A750 is able to benefit from all of that extra memory bandwidth. Unfortunately, enabling ray tracing in Star Wars Jedi Survivor does cripple the A750, and in this example, it's slower than even the RX 7600. At 1080p, we're seeing a 36% performance deficit to the RTX 4060, while the Intel GPU was 30% slower at 1440p. Hitman 3 is one of the oldest games that we're currently testing with, and the A750 does really well in this established title, basically matching the RTX 4060 at 1080p, and that meant it was 7% faster at 1440p. So competitive performance overall, and very impressive for around $200 US. And it's even better with ray tracing enabled. We're looking at RTX 4060-like performance at 1080p, with 13% greater performance seen at 1440p, or 33% greater performance when compared to the RX 7600. So again, very good results here in Hitman with ray tracing enabled. Now we see that the A750, it's a lot less impressive in F123, despite delivering what I would call very solid performance overall, certainly very playable performance. But here it is 40% slower than the RTX 4060 at 1080p, though it was able to claw back quite a bit of that margin at 1440p, where it's now 28% slower. Still a big margin though, but probably about what you'd expect from a GPU that does cost around $100 US less. Enabling ray tracing doesn't really help the A750 in its battle with the next-gen GPUs from AMD and Nvidia, as here it's 27% slower at 1080p. Still, despite low frame rates overall, that margin was reduced to just 16% at 1440p. Now, moving on to Resident Evil 4, we find very competitive performance from both the A750 using the prioritized graphics quality preset. Here it was just 17% slower than the RTX 4060, and impressively, that margin was eliminated at 1440p with both GPUs rendering 65 FPS on average. Then with ray tracing enabled using the maximum quality preset, we find some truly impressive results for the A750 as it blew away the RX 7600 and even beat the RTX 4060, delivering 14% more performance at 1080p and 10% more at 1440p. Next up, we have the Callisto Protocol, and again, the A750 looks good here with 85 FPS on average at 1080p, making it just 16% slower than the RTX 4060, and we saw that it was just 13% slower at 1440p. The ray tracing performance in the Callisto Protocol isn't as impressive, though it's competitive at 1080p, especially with the Radeon GPU, and a 21% loss to the much more expensive RTX 4060. It's not that bad. We're also looking at strong performance from the A750 in Far Cry 6. 97 FPS at 1080p meant it was 18% slower than the RTX 4060 and 8% slower than the RX 7600. Then at 1440p the margins are reduced, and now the A750 is just 13% slower than the GeForce GPU. And then if we enable ray tracing, we see that the A750 is 16% slower at 1080p and just 7% slower at 1440p. So again, given the price, I think those are some pretty good results. The A750 was good for 95 FPS at 1080p in Forza Horizon 5, which is obviously good performance overall, though that did make it 23% slower than the RTX 4060 and 21% slower than the RX 7600. Unfortunately, enabling ray tracing with the Extreme preset did seem to cripple the A750 a bit, certainly more than you'd expect based on the ultra quality results. At 1080p, the frame rate dropped to 73 FPS, and that meant it was 31% slower than the 4060, but just 13% slower than the RX 7600. The margins did come down quite significantly at 1440p, as here the A750 was 22% slower than the RTX 4060 and just 7% slower than the RX 7600. Moving on, we find the A750 was good for 76 FPS in Cyberpunk 2077 using the high quality preset, and that's a great result given that that made it just 7% slower than the RTX 4060. Then at 1440p, it was actually slightly faster than the RTX 4060, and right there with the RX 7600 with 52 FPS. The ray tracing performance though, it's a bit of a blowout. The A750, like other GPUs tested here, just can't come close to delivering playable performance under these test conditions. But still, it was much better than the RX 7600. The second last game that we're going to look at the individual results for is Marvel's Spider-Man Remastered, and here the A750 produced 110 FPS at 1080p, which is a good result overall, though that did make it 26% slower than the RTX 4060, which is quite a significant margin. But as is often the case, the margin was greatly reduced at 1440p, as here the A750 was just 17% slower with 85 FPS versus 102 FPS. And then enabling ray tracing doesn't really change too much here. At 1080p, the A750 is still 22% slower, so similar to what we saw previously without RTFX enabled. And then at 1440p, we are once again seeing that the A750 trails the RTX 4060 by a 16% margin, though this time the Intel GPU was able to match the RX 7600. Has to be said that Hogwarts Legacy is not a great title for the A750. There are a few titles where it does struggle, The Last of Us Part 1 being another clear example, and we'll look at the margins for that game in the big comparison graphs in a moment. Here we see though that a 25% loss to the RTX 4060 at 1080p, it's not exactly terrible I suppose, but a 33% loss to the RX 7600, that's probably what jumps out here. To be fair though, the A750 did reel in the competition at 1440p, coming in 20% slower than the RTX 4060, though it was still 31% slower than the RX 7600. The big issue though for the A750 and Hogwarts Legacy can be seen when trying to enable ray tracing, as here it ends up being 43% slower than the RTX 4060 at 1080p and 27% slower than the RX 7600, and the 1440p data, well, it's just no better. Okay, so we've just had a look at a dozen of the 40 plus games tested with and without ray tracing enabled, and now it's time to see how these GPUs compare across all of the games tested. So let's go do that, starting with the 1080p data. So here we are, the 1080p results covering all 54 test configurations, and overall, the A750 was 19% slower than the RTX 4060, which isn't bad given it's at least 27% cheaper. There are some standout bad results though for Intel, and The Last of Us Part 1 is a glaring example, along with Hogwarts Legacy using ray tracing and then F123. Still, there are some highly positive examples as well, such as Resident Evil 4, Hitman 3 and Control. Now, even if we remove the ray tracing results, the A750 is still just 19% slower than the RTX 4060, and I say just 19% because it is at least 27% cheaper, so taking that into account, I think the performance that we're seeing here is quite good. And then if we look at just the ray tracing results, we see the A750 is still 18% slower. So scaling relative to the RTX 4060 is much the same with or without RTFX enabled. Now, the A750 and its greater memory bandwidth resulted in much more impressive performance at the 1440p resolution, at least relative to the RTX 4060, as here it was just 13% slower on average. Again, The Last of Us Part 1 and Hogwarts Legacy were problematic, but those titles aside, I think performance overall was typically very good. And the rasterization only results again show similar margins, and here it's really only The Last of Us Part 1 that saw problematic results for the A750. Then when looking at just the ray tracing data, we find that at 1440p the A750 was on average 14% slower than the RTX 4060, which is another solid result for Intel. So there you have it, almost 1 year in the wild, and I think it's safe to say that Intel's Arc GPUs, they've come a long way. Upon release, the Arc series, it was plagued with compatibility and stability problems, and on top of that, the value just wasn't there, losing out in terms of value to comparable Radeon GPUs. Today, the Arc situation is much improved, and while not perfect, Intel has proven they're willing to invest the time and money to make it work. Now, during my testing, I did run into a few issues. For example, Halo often crashes when loading the campaign, and once I did manage to load the game, I was faced with texture corruption issues. But Intel is aware of this problem and claims that a future driver update will fix the problem. Another issue was seen in Control. In order to enable ray tracing, I had to use a command in Steam that forced the game to load using the DirectX 12 mode. Really not a big deal, but also not an issue when using an AMD or Nvidia GPU. And then there's the performance issues. The Last of Us Part 1 was unplayable using the ultra quality preset at 1080p, and this shouldn't be the case. Also, performance in Hogwarts Legacy wasn't as good as it should have been, and while F123 ran quite well overall, I'm sure there's still some optimization work to be done in that title. Overall though, Arc is now in a much better place, and providing you're not heavily playing one of those titles with a few issues still, the experience should be very good. Now, when it comes to value, it's difficult to nail down a part like the A750, as there's a lot of things to consider. But if we base our performance measurements on all 54 test configurations just looked at, I'd say that coming in 19% slower than the RTX 4060 while costing 27 to 33% less is very good. That also made it 12% slower than the RX 7600 at a 19 to 26% saving. So again, pretty good there as well. And of course, a more direct competitor right now would be the Radeon RX 6600, and sadly, I haven't had a chance to dedicate days of my time, or almost a week in fact, to run the RX 6600 through these same 54 tests. But based on the data we do have, the A750 should now be around 6 to 7% faster than the RX 6600 on average, and with both priced around $200 to $220 US, that does make the A750 better value. And the advantage of the A750 is superior ray tracing performance, for whatever that's worth at this performance tier, while the advantage of the RX 6600 is just more reliable performance, so better compatibility with much more mature drivers. So given all of that, it is difficult to recommend the A750 over the RX 6600 or a $250 US RX 6650 XT, and even the savings when compared to the RX 7600 might be a bit difficult to justify. Still, the A750, it's certainly a viable option at the current $200 to $220 asking price, and that is a fair discount from the original $290 US MSRP. Anyway, let me know what you think about the A750 at its current price and what it offers, and have you actually purchased an A750 or maybe even an A770? I'd love to hear about your personal experiences with it. And that is going to do it for this video. Don't forget to check out our merch at the Harbour Unboxed store, harbourunboxed.com. You can get this hoodie or some other meme merch. And if you'd also like to become a Harbour Unboxed member, then check out Floatplane Patreon. You can sign up to either one of those and it'll get access to stuff like, what do we have? We have an exclusive Discord server for members only. We do a monthly live stream. Tim and I get together, answer your questions live and talk about whatever's been going on that month. Behind the scenes content, Q&A stuff, a lot of cool things there, so check that out if you're interested. But if not, that's perfectly fine. And I would like to thank you for watching this video. I'm your host, Steve. See you next time.